This special episode is part of our Critical Engagements with Histories of Whiteness seminar series, in which we explore the shifting contours of racialized whiteness in South Africa, its privileges, policing, and enduring presence in our contemporary landscape. Dr. Azille Coetzee joins us as she explores the intimate terrains of white Afrikaner femininity, decolonisation, and desire. In a talk drawn from her compelling book, Desire at the End of the White Line, Dr. Coetzee invites us to think critically about what white women in South Africa are taught to want and how that wanting continues to structure both complicity and longing.
What is feminism? I sometimes get asked what feminism is. I am white and Afrikaans, and in my culture the term is regarded with great suspicion. When it is said out loud at a braai, in a bar, or at a family lunch, one can often see how people's posture changes slightly. A shoulder pulled back or a head cocked. A glance might flit between two friends. Could you just quickly explain what that word actually means? Someone might ask. Maar wat beteken dit nou eintlik? And in the inflection of the voice or the slow no eintlik at the end, every white Afrikaans feminist knows what they're up against. I try really hard to avoid these conversations, but when I find myself in one, my answer has been the same for a very long time. Feminism is that when you believe that men and women should be equal. Not the same, one must quickly explain because people really hate that, but equivalent in their difference. This answer elicits relief. Almost no one thinks consciously of themselves as being a person that disagrees with such an idea, and you can see how everyone relaxes around you again. Someone tells a story about the oppressed women in Afghanistan who are not allowed to drive, or a black woman colleague who gets hit by her man. Everyone nods gravely that feminism is necessary, elsewhere, for others. Then a friend pours you another drink, and the conversation moves on. I am some years into the study of feminism now, and my answer has changed. What I know now is that in a place like South Africa, we cannot talk about gender without talking about race. Which is the wrong answer to give at the braai. You're out for a good time, because if there's one topic that white Afrikaans people dislike more than gender, it is race. In answer to the question, what's race got to do with rape? South African feminist scholar Pondoland answers unequivocally, everything. Yvette Abrams refers to the colonial encounter in South Africa as the genital encounter. And South African scholar and poet Gabeba Badroen argues that the South African social system is founded on the normalized and institutionalized practices of sexual violence that characterize the 176 years of slavery at the Cape. There's therefore a growing body of feminist scholarship and literature in which gender and sexual violence are explored as key to the making of race in South Africa's history of slavery, colonialism, and apartheid. This means that addressing gender oppression in our present requires confronting the legacy of slavery, colonialism, and apartheid. It means interrogating the racial categories and inequalities that structure our society, the spatial segregation that still marks our cities and towns. In other words, we cannot separate struggles for gender justice from the labor of racial transformation. What is feminism then? In our context, it is the work of decolonisation, of land redistribution. It is the work of racial reparation. It is the work of chipping away at the binary categories of man and woman, but also white and black, and the violence required to maintain them. The reverse is just as important. The ongoing project of decolonisation in South Africa requires careful scrutiny of gender norms and systems of gender oppression as a primary site where colonial hierarchies and boundaries are renewed in the present. In this book that we're talking about today, my aim is to contribute to bringing the issue of white women's bodies and gender emancipation to the very urgent and ongoing conversation about what decolonisation requires of us today. At the heart of this work is the very basic question I'm repeatedly confronted with as white Afrikaans person 30 years after the ending of apartheid. Why haven't we changed more yet? Why are our lives still so white and so separate? Becoming white. Race is made, not given, and the Afrikaner was not always white. One only needs to think of the extreme violence of apartheid to see that for them, us, whiteness never came easily. It was an aspiration that required an immense amount of resources, organizing, the disciplining and surveillance of the self, and great brutality against others. The Afrikaner folk as a racial ethnic identity came to exist relatively recently through a deliberate process of self-invention in resistance to British imperialism by a group of people that up to that point were dispersed across vast distances and did not have much in common. Christie van der Westhuizen notes that the Afrikaner identity was historically forged in reaction to white Afrikaans speakers' status of being marked as just about white in relation to hegemonic whiteness. So the Afrikaners had indigenized to such, and I know that word is very heavy there, and I do talk about it more in the book, so I'm not flippantly throwing it around. The Afrikaners had indigenized to such an extent that the British did not consider them properly white, so that the Afrikaners understood their relationship to the British as one of imperial oppression, a situation that led to the South African War, an anti-imperial war in which the Afrikaners fought for the right to rule themselves on land that they deemed themselves just about indigenous to. The group of people who would later become unified as the Afrikaners lost the war, and it left them traumatized and ravished by poverty. However, not even considering the possibility of seeking solidarity with the truly indigenous people of South Africa against the force of British extractive imperialism, they accepted a power-sharing agreement with the British and doggedly pursued the project of establishing and proving their whiteness, cultivating a coherent ethnic identity through which to lay claim to the privilege a colonial world extends to white people. For the Afrikaners, whiteness was therefore always something that we had to prove, that one had to learn to perform, to conform to, something that you can slide out of if you are not vigilant about the kind of life you are living and whom you are living it with. Our whiteness is work that we are trained to do among ourselves unremittingly. How does one prove whiteness? How do you look and live white? In our colonial, and this is where sex and gender and desire comes in. In our colonial and apartheid history, whiteness as a category is constituted with reference to the sexual and intimate lives of people. It is informed and marked by a certain kind of sexual morality, sensibility, and comportment that women, in particular, are expected to uphold. Historians show that the patriarchal nuclear family form and everything it implies historically, compulsory heterosexuality, reproductivity, monogamy, gender binaries, and hierarchy, provides a symbolic grammar through which the Afrikaner people have traditionally thought ourselves white, framed our collective future, and claimed a place here, through which we justified an entitlement to land. In Afrikaner history, the correctly ordered white family unit constitutes the gendered blueprint of a nation. Being the white volkenleier, leader of the people, is a natural progression of responsible white fatherhood, where the language of family renders the dominance of the white man over the woman in his house and his dominance over black people in his territory equally natural and obvious. And in the book, I go into detail about how you can see this playing out historically. Importantly, the self-invented mythology of the white Afrikaners through the nuclear family also serves as a vehicle for the discursive justification of the claims to land, insofar as it provides patrilineal lineage as a natural and God-given way to govern the inheritance of land between white men. It goes from father to son, father to son. In 1948, the companion projects of white heteropatriarchy and colonial racialization culminates in the apartheid regime, the racial logic which is based on a familial model and organized around sex. This can be seen clearly in the fact that the first two major laws passed by the apartheid government pertained to sex, the Prohibition of Marriages Act in 1949 and the Immorality Act in 1950. In this scheme, the white Afrikaner woman is positioned in a crucial way. It is she who births the white babies. It is she through whom the line unfolds. Without female subjects obedient to the proposed ideal femininity, there is no nation. Because of the key role that white women played in the work of instantiating, reproducing, and maintaining white Afrikanerness as ethnic identity, white women ending up with black men had to be prevented at all costs. An injunction that would conveniently, for the apartheid authorities, consolidate the colonial imperatives of controlling the sexuality of the white woman on the one hand and enforcing racial segregation and exploitation of black people on the other. White women having sex with men outside of their race group signified not only the danger of racial mixing, but also undermined white male power over and access to women, calling into question the natural hierarchical order on which the whole system was built. In this sense, Apartheid systems of racial control and segregation were inseparable from structures of white patriarchal rule of men over women. Accordingly, and this is the point that anchors my thinking in this book, in our history, who the white Afrikaans woman wants, who she slips into bed with, chooses as kin, was never only a personal matter. It is much more complicated than preference. At stake, then and now, I argue, is nothing less than the white line, the precious white skin. At stake is the power of the white man and land, place. Her desire is racialized as a public feeling. In this book, I ask, what would happen if she were to go against the path laid out for her? If she were to want something else? In her book, Begging to be Black, Antjie Krog strikingly expresses her longing as a plea to be part of the country she was born in. I need to know whether it is possible for somebody like me to become like the majority, to become blacker, she writes, and live as a full and at-ease component of the South African psyche. She wrote this in 2009. It was a different time, before the student movements, before we reached the collective disillusionment with the Rainbow Nation rhetoric of forgiveness and a non-racial future. Now, 30 years after the legislative end of apartheid, Krog's wish to become blacker or a full component of the South African psyche seems naive when so little has changed structurally and spatially in South Africa, where whiteness still connotes so much privilege, and identity politics has highlighted the problems that arise when well-meaning white people try to forget their own whiteness, or the extent to which blackness is already conveniently appropriated by white people whenever there is financial or cultural advantage. Of course, if we read Krog carefully, her agonizing longing to become blacker is very specifically rooted in a deep acknowledgement of the historical violence vested in whiteness and its ongoing privilege. It's an expression of the wish to repudiate the global sanctity of the white body, to share the vulnerability of the black body. It is about asking what mode of becoming might secure a post-colonial future. This project is out of fashion, and because it is articulated in the dated vocabulary of non-racialism and universal human rights, we dismiss it out of hand, sometimes very easily. However, it is Krog's kind of longing that I pick up again in this book more than a decade later. The hope that we can be different, repair or remake the violent, rigid and isolating whiteness that colonialism and apartheid imposed on us into something more free and livable for ourselves and for others. What would it take for us to change? What is it that arrests our present? How do we access its release? White feminism. The more one reads, it's a great picture. The more one reads about white Afrikaner history, the less surprised one becomes that feminism is so fraught in our culture. In our history, the strong women who took action and claimed a voice did not identify as feminists, but as volksmoeders, mothers of the nation. South African feminist writer Lumeri Krier shows how women were active agents in the mobilization of the folk and how they activated motherhood for such purposes. So in the 20th century, the volksmoeder ideal became a way through which women could exercise political power as women within the bounds of Afrikaner nationalism, a register through which they could exert their own influence in the political landscape of the day while performing the subjugated roles it assigns to them as mothers and wives. The white Afrikaner woman wages apartheid in the name of the family through motherhood, while at the same time performing an apolitical passivity, a pretty femininity, conveniently and agreeably uninterested in its own power. But why? Why contribute to and invest at all in a movement that requires your own subordination? Why not reach beyond it? This is not the past. I feel it in myself, this willingness to cede power to the white man. And it is the contradiction that pulses through most of the stories we tell, as I show throughout the book. We see this in many of the women in Boersoeke Vrou, the Afrikaans television program. Women with deep voices and practical shoes who can take their drink and shoot a buck, but who submit themselves prettily to the needs of the boer, the humiliating ritual of the show. We see this in a post-feminist powerhouse like Minkie van der Westhuizen, who wields great cultural and financial power effortlessly and with flair, but at the same time carefully and consistently presents herself as being a devoted wife and mother first. We don't need feminism, we are known to say, because we are empowered already. If we choose a certain kind of femininity in relation to a man, it's because we choose it. We tell ourselves that this is what we want. I ask again, why? Why the obedience? Why not do something else? An explanation that Creer ventures, one that that can still be read off the shiny surfaces of middle-class white femininity in contemporary South Africa. The big SUVs, the gel nails, the private schools, the security gates, the Woolies food, is that Afrikaner women choose to cast their feminist aspirations in the language and conceptual frame of motherhood and white nationalism because of the ethnic privilege and influence, also the sheer spending power it affords. The white Afrikaner woman reconciles herself with the master's tools because she does not really have the heart to dismantle his house. 'n ryk wit meisie verloor haar adventurous spirit die oomblik wat sy haar comforts moet opgee, writes Ronaldo Comfort, Black Afrikaans poet. A rich white girl loses her adventurous spirit the moment that she has to give up her comforts. Sitting pretty is what Chrissy van der Westhuizen calls it, and we are still doing it, she says, at the heart of our post-apartheid white suburbs, with their security gates and neighborhood watches, these micro-apartheid geographies where apartheid divisions are privatized in lieu of state enforcement. At the center of it is still the home, shaped by specific ethno-racial heteronormative domesticity. Now that the imperative of white reproduction is not institutionalized at state level anymore, writes van der Westhuizen, it becomes the responsibility of the family alone and women in particular. In suburbs such as Welgemoot, Mosselstrif, Waterkloof and Oranjezicht, social membership and a relation to the future comes at a price. Public subscription to the heterosexual life narrative and white procreative monogamy. If you're a woman, you know exactly what this means. Your muscles hold the memory. In her research, van der Westhuizen shows that the ethic of service that women continue to owe the folk includes household labor, sexual passivity, managing affect in the family, ensuring the leisure of men, and most importantly, reproducing white children. In the world of the white Afrikaans middle and upper classes, reproductivity directs our lives, mediates our relations to everyone and everything else. And if you are a woman, it orders your aspirations, your relation to wealth, and what you dare to expect from the world. The argument running through van der Westhuizen's growing body of work on white Afrikaner femininity is therefore that although the shift to democracy allowed for the unstitching of the Afrikaner nationalist family's hierarchical unity, which provided an opportunity for the reconfiguration of the subject position of the Afrikaner woman, we continue to remake ourselves around the nodal point of the volksmoeder. The result is a re-inscription of colonial and apartheid gender organization and the naturalization of white Afrikaner reproduction. I believe van der Westhuizen because I feel it. I see it everywhere I look. The disciplining of white Afrikaner women's sexual desire through familial politics therefore remains key to the privatized racial boundary policing through which white Afrikaans people stay in place and stay separate. I write this book driven by a feeling that I share with many of my feminist and queer friends, a feeling revolutionary, feeling together that our current situation is not enough, that something is indeed missing and we cannot live without it. It is fantasizing about going off script together, about imagining new patterns of relating, new forms of collectivity, delinked from family and land. If the white Afrikaner future as white and everything that entails is brought into being through white heterosexual procreative monogamy, what new ways of being here, what new political tongues are made possible by different conceptions of sex? What are the changed possibilities of identity, intelligibility, publics, culture that become possible when the procreative white heterosexual couple is no longer the only fantasy zone from within which the future can be thought and willed for me? Love is a political event, writes Elizabeth Bovenelli. Some notes on desire. In his book, History of Sexuality, Michel Foucault famously rejects the prevailing Freudian Marxist idea of sexual desire as a biological instinct subversive of power, or something that exists as an exterior domain to which power is applied in order to silence or repress it. Rather, sexuality is a result and an instrument of power's design, or a dense transfer point of power charged with instrumentality. Foucault therefore contradicts an idea that continues to prevail in contemporary society, namely that our sexual desires, fantasies, tendencies, and behaviors can reveal some truth about our real and hidden selves as we exist beyond or outside the force and conditioning exercised on us through systems of power. On the contrary, through sexual discourses, rules, norms, and ideas, social and self-disciplinary regimes are inserted into the most intimate domains of society exactly by suturing them to the dimensions of ourselves that we deem to be natural or pre-political or true in some essential and hidden way. In her book, The Right to Sex, Amia Srinivasan asks, if who we desire and do not desire is a political matter, determined by patterns of domination and exclusion, and this we see in the way in which I, as white woman, is turned to the white man. From the moment I learn how to see the world, I know that that's where I must be going with my sexual desire. So Srinivasan asks, if who we desire and do not desire is a political matter, determined by patterns of domination and exclusion, isn't there a duty to transfigure our desires? In other words, if desire is a vector for political power, if it can be conditioned to serve certain political agendas, do we not have a moral obligation to condition it otherwise? What happens when I emancipate my desire from the dictates of white genealogy? If Afrikaner whiteness is structured by procreative heterosexual sexuality, if the love plot of heterosexual intimacy provides the tacit but central organizing index of ethnic belonging and social membership, what happens when we go off script? If whom I turn to in desire as a white woman and whom I shrink from in fear, mark and uphold the boundaries which are electrified and walled of the white enclave, the white body, what kind of side entrances, hidden exits, irregular lines of acquaintance, alternate routes, and disordered geographies start opening up in my world when I desire differently? When I, in the words of Lauren Belant and Michael Warner, pursue intimacies that bear no relation to domestic space, to kinship, to the couple form, to property, or to the nation. How to become black? What is required of the other in order to be in relation with blackness is one of the questions asked by Mpondo thinker Hugo Kakanam in his book Riotous Deathscapes. As part of the answer to the question, he tells a story. The early settlers in Pondoland arrived by ship, sometimes voluntarily and at other times because they were shipwrecked on the jagged and windy wild coast. Sometime in the late 18th century, an expedition led by Jacob van Renen found a community of castaway survivors far from the Cape, consisting of people, and I'm quoting here, descended from whites, some too from slaves of mixed color, and the natives of East Indies. Among these castaways that Jacob van Renen found were 3 old white women whom a local Mpondo chief had taken as wives. The women said that they were sisters and had, when children, been shipwrecked on the coast, but they could not say of what nation they were, being too young to know at the time the accident happened. Van Renen's expedition offered to take them back to Europe to rescue them, an offer about which the women initially, and I quote, seemed very much pleased. However, the women soon started having second thoughts, and then, when the time came, refused to leave, citing the need to tend their crops. Also, they said that if they were to go back to Europe, they would need to take their children and families with them. This would probably have been fine in principle, but on closer inspection, it turned out that the children and families referred to amounted to about 400 people, and this is where the rescuers drew the line. In thinking about these white castaways on the coast of Pondoland, who intersected with his own lineage, Kanam sees how a different kind of white life is possible. a life not saturated in whiteness, of living otherwise. He reads the woman's refusal to leave as an act of errantry and a claim to blackness, clasping the possibility of being different. The tribe of castaways and Pondo locals became known as Amachomane, which translates to literally mean to be locked in friendly relation. After I finished reading Riotous Deathscapes, I found myself thinking about these three white women for days. White women who stayed behind, learned to speak isiMpondo, and grew to love and be loved by Mpondo people. This, writes Kanam, is how to become black. Thanks to Sedigo. What do I want? At the center of this conversation is a very old feminist point. It matters how we live our lives. Our most personal and intimate habits, decisions, tendencies, and feelings carry political weight and meaning. This is the case specifically in a place like South Africa, where the sexual and the familial were historically instrumentalized in service of settler placemaking, colonial domination, white supremacy, and racial segregation. I make the point that we as white Afrikaner women occupy a pivotal place in all of this. Our sexual lives, care, and reproductive labor co-opted for the purposes of making a white nation, of keeping the Afrikaner white, landed, and apart. For us here, the personal is political, particularly so. If we want the world to change, we have to be willing to change ourselves. I hope that this book can serve as an invitation to the reader to reflect on the political shape of their own sexual and familial lives. I hope, especially if you're a white Afrikaner woman, you might be led to ask, and ask not once, but over and over again, and not quickly, but slowly. What is it that I desire? What do I fear, and why? What do I want sexually, and how does this orient me in place? Who does it turn me towards, and who do I shrink away from? How does what I want determine where I go, who I go there with, and how I move? What are real preferences, and what is it that I have been taught to want, disciplined to pursue, and to work for? How do I spend my time? With whom? What do I do with my days? Where do I invest my energy, and why? Who do I care for? Who do I talk to? What do I care about? What are the rules? Who makes them? And what happens if I break them? What is the story I tell about myself? What are the stories I narrate to my children? What do I feel? What do I expect from the world? What else is there?
In opening our conversation today, I was so curious about a line from the book, especially in line with what the seminar series is intending to be, is to look critically at processes of race and racialization in South Africa. So I would like to open up our conversation with a line. So you say, in other words, for people to become and to stay white collectively, the very first step is to make sure that the women are tending to their homes, has husbands and their children in an appropriate way. And throughout the text, just for those to create an appetite for the book in the room, it is profoundly personal. It is at times shockingly personal because I know you, and also it's like, wow. But it's profoundly personal, and it makes this line made me think of the conversation that you have in part 2 of the book, where you say that you were raised in the early 2000s and the 90s with freedom, and you could do what you want, have sex with who you want. You were supported by a group of women, but inversely, you followed a script. So the line that I was referring to earlier on is taken from part 5 of the Carnegie Commission report on the 4 white problem in South Africa, which Maria Rothman writes. And that line of appropriate ways and the script that you highlight in part 2. Can you speak to how the past echoes in you?
Yeah, and I think that is also why, so in the book, I really, part of it is really memoir also, because I'm asking, how should I live? As a white person in South Africa today, how should I actually be living? How should I actually be spending my time, and with who? And so that is why I make it so personal, because Well, firstly, also for the reader to make it personal for themselves, because then you read my story, maybe you think, oh, this is just theory, it doesn't apply to me, but then I explain how I live and I show how the theory applies to me, and then you're like, oh, wait, it's actually the same for me, or, oh, no, I managed to do it differently, so that's good, or whatever. So it's, and that is why it gets so personal, and that is why the process of the book was also really, for me, one of looking at my life and saying, why am I doing the things that I'm doing, and what else could I be doing, and what do I want? And so these old scripts. So this sounds almost trite, but for me, the insight really changed how I looked at myself and looked at whiteness. If you want a white nation, if you are anxious about maintaining, even now, and this is in the past, but also now, as you are asking, if you have that racial anxiety that characterizes white Afrikaner life, about that we must be properly white and we must have our little separate neighborhoods, if you're anxious in that way, you really need the white woman to have white babies. So you need the white women to be sleeping with white men, making families with white men, and you need the white women to raise the white babies as white people in a very specific way. So as soon as the white women turn away, either to other women or to black people, then that little enclave with a white family at its center, producing more white children that are taken to little white schools and singing the Afrikaans songs and whatever, that, I'm not saying it should disappear, but then that kind of thing starts merging with other people, other culture. It opens up towards. So, yeah, my argument is also not like that it all should disappear. It's about it opening up as opposed to staying closed. And it's the white woman that is almost key to that opening. Because in a sense, the white man can do what he wants, and it doesn't really affect, like, it's really important that the white woman must be reproducing the culture through the children that she's having. So, and this we see everywhere in the culture. Like if you look at Afrikaans magazines, if you look at Afrikaans television, it's all stories about white heterosexual reproduction, and so often it's linked to land. So if you switch on Kijknet now, you will see a story about there's a wife and a husband, and there's some problems, and the problems between them threatens the family's ownership of the farm. It's always linked to land. So it's this thing of, so this thing that I feel in myself and that we really get socialized into so hard is this thing that we must be with white men, and this is our path, and this is where we end up, and then we have the babies, and that is the primary way in which we define ourselves in the world, is through this this narrative of motherhood. And it's very, like, you literally also, and I've mentioned this at a few book talks now because it's just such a good example, so sorry if you're hearing it again and it's boring, but there was recently a cover of Minky on one of these Afrikaans magazines, and she was saying the title of the article that was on the cover. She was saying, "Ek is nie 'n superstar. I'm not a superstar or a like businesswoman. I'm only a mom." And that's just not true. She is a superstar, and it's in our context, and she is a business mogul. Why is it so important for us to always firstly say, I'm firstly a mom, yes, and that is my entire thing, and that is such a big part. So it's that I feel. And then if you choose not to live that life, and this is also for me where it started sparking, is this how difficult it is to find words in which to make yourself legible in the culture if you are not a woman getting married to a white man and having babies. Then it's really people don't understand where to place you. They don't understand what they are scared of you. I often get comments of women who say, or I would hear people saying of me that they're kind of scared of me. So it's that thing of that people don't know where to place you. So it would be that. I think it's a long answer to your question.
No, but I think it's a necessary answer because of the quote that I read. I was most interested in the appropriate ways of being white, and once you you navigate away from appropriate ways of being white, it's so interesting that you get to the point of fear. Something that I am currently engaging with is portrayals of Black women in media. So, for instance, TikTok has become such a great medium for young people to engage on. And I came across this video where they are lip syncing to Early B's song. And the Early B as this is a rapper, great cadence, captivating Afrikaans rapper. But in it, he's speaking about an abusive relationship. Where there is homosexual slurs thrown against him. He's in a relationship with a racialized colored woman. And the argument is that there is, at the same time, great passion. She embodies great passion, but also has the capacity for violence. So once you navigate away from Minkie van der Westhuizen's version of femininity and whiteness, then you are getting into Ankie Krog's territory and speaking about becoming blacker. And what does that mean with your proximity towards the folk, towards the nation, and towards white men and white land? So your answer is incredibly important because you are sort of pulling at those threads. So my next question, because I don't want to harp on too long about that point, is about the hidden costs. Same section of the book where you speak about the difference between werkskrag, which is labor power, and werk. Because embedded behind werkskrag, and you can elaborate on that more greatly, it implies that white women aren't doing that work alone. So hidden behind M.E. Rothman's call to white women to take up their place in the home, the hidden labor there is the labor of Black people, upholding the nation, upholding the home. So in your engagement, especially in those kind of works, what was the engagement?
So Black labor features in such interesting ways in the kind of constituting narrative of white Afrikaner identity. So on the one hand, it's this, like you mentioned now, that the white Afrikaner woman must be seen as this woman who is really willing to work for her family and she keeps everything in place. But of course, she's not the one doing all of that. The other side is, if you look at white Afrikaans, like the historical, the big novels, but also even today, if you look at Hoorshike Vrou, if you look at so many of these television programs of the white farmer, you never see the Black farm workers. Like they're almost never on screen, that you just catch like little flashes of them in the pages of the stories, but almost never. And that is also because the story of the Afrikaner entitlement to land is the story that we kind of hacked the wilderness into submission with our own bare hands. And this is how we managed to, this is why we can lay claim to the land. But it wasn't the white farmer doing that. It was his laborers hacking the wilderness into it's not only the white farmer's family bones that are buried in the earth. It's, I mean, generations and generations of Blackface. So then the presence of the Black laborer, the male laborer on the land and the woman laborer in the house, undermines like these absolutely constitutive narratives of who we are and why we get to be here. So it's invisibilized. And so then also another very important aspect of the work, and this is something that I don't focus on that much, but throughout the pages, I point you in directions where you can go read more of it. But is that so we, on the one hand, we have this gender disciplining of the perfect little white family, and this is a way in which whiteness is performed. But then on the other hand of these colonial narratives is what you said now of the Black woman being portrayed. So the Black woman is the inverse of the white woman. She's being portrayed as not like appropriate woman. She's being portrayed as kind of wild, as aggressive, so in these old colonial narratives. And Black men are being portrayed as sexually dangerous. And these narratives are still activated in current day practices of racial segregation, like neighborhood watch practices where the Black man walking in the street is a sexual fear that it is kind of sparks in the white imagination. And that's a legitimation to kind of push him out of the neighborhood and say, what are you doing here? So it's these old fears. So what I'm getting at is that this little, the very strict gender binary and very strict little family politics of the white family that through which we prove ourselves to be properly white. The other side of it is a projection of a kind of a foil, which is a kind of primitive sexuality of Black people. And this is from Nokola's work. This renders the Black woman unrapeable in the eyes of the law, that anything can be done to her, and it doesn't count as rape because she's sexual and wild in any case. And through that narrative, we paint the Black man as a natural rapist. So the little white family with its gender politics has a very dark opposite. And this happens in colonial contexts everywhere, but we still really see it playing out in our context. So gender is so relevant, not only on the white side of things here, but also on the oppressive colonial side towards Black people.
And right now you're speaking about the centralization in gender in processes of racialization. In the talk and in the book, you mentioned that Afrikaners weren't always white. And that is so pertinent to what is currently happening on the global stage. And the point that I'm trying to make here is that in the talk, you shied away from the uses of indigeneity. And that was used both in pre-apartheid, the segregationist era, running into apartheid in 1948, and then also currently being used in the present. And I've said this, I think, in a talk before, on the cusp of the National Party winning the 1948 election. D.F. Malan, first Prime Minister, travels to Johannesburg by plane, and when he gets there, the first thing he says to reporters is, "Now we are no longer strangers in our own land." So the claiming of indigeneity is central in the apartheid policy making, the indigenization of movement practices per se. So the indigenization of something like rugby becoming our national sport. It's all part of this project of indigenizing, but keeping separate. So in your book, you say at the heart of the text lies the question, why are we still so separate? Why have we not changed? And I would like you to sort of speak to that dichotomy between indigenizing, becoming African, Thabo Mbeki claiming in his African Renaissance that Afrikaners are also part of the South African story, that indigeneity, the fact that Afrikaners has now been given refugee status in South Africa, but the response that they've given is that, thank you so much, Mr. Trump, for what you've done, however we would like to stay. Even with the opportunity to leave, they want to stay. Yeah. And I would like you to speak to that dichotomy between indigenization and separateness, which translates in Afrikaans to apartheid.
Yes. So it's so that whole thing is extremely interesting because so there's a Italian scholar who wrote a book. His name is Lorenzo Berrancini or something. And he says the settler subjectivity is always one between two poles. It is about ancestral roots elsewhere and indigenization. So you can never get too much of one. He says it's lines that come in close. I can't remember it well enough now to say it in his way, but if you, as settler, if you indigenize too much, you lose your ties with Europe or your ancestral roots, then you're not settler anymore. Then and we did see that in Afrikaner history how some people did not manage to stay white, and they got part of communities that were not white, and that were we see in a place like the Cape where skin color is so. It tells you nothing about someone. It speaks of a place in which many people did not. People did mix properly, and their lives and bloodlines, which is a problematic word also, but did mix. So then you're not settler anymore. Then you cannot claim to the privilege of whiteness anymore. So you have to, but if you don't indigenize at all, then you cannot claim that you belong here and that you are entitled to the land. So you have to, it's this fine balance between saying, I'm indigenous, I've indigenized, I belong here, this is my land, I have generations of my family line extends on this piece of land. And then on the other side saying, no, but actually I'm from Dutch descent, or I'm from English descent, or whatever. So then it's this, and J.M. Coetzee writes in his book, White Writing, he says that the white Afrikaner was particularly unsettled settlers from the beginning. We are struggling with that dichotomy. And it's this, if you also look, it's another big trope and another big theme throughout white Afrikaans culture, popular culture and literature, is this longing for a thuiskoms, for a coming home. It's really at the center of so much of the art we make, so much of the culture we produce. And that, I think that is because of that unsettledness between this tension of indigenizing and having ancestral roots elsewhere.
And it's a hard thing to grapple with. That's why I'm asking you the question, because it's something that I struggle with in my own scholarship. So this will be my last question before we open up to everyone else. And I'd like to speak about apartheid in the erotic imagination. And it made me think of the historian Janneke Thumbrand's work. He's looking at histories of social work and sociology and how that constituted colored as a category by the apartheid state. And in one of the arguments made by her, and then more closely with Lindy Coetzee, actually, also another historian, she says that added to the list of threats to whiteness was the colored population, because it was not only a threat to racial purity, but it was the actual manifestation of blood mixing. Bloedvermenging in Afrikaans, which is a very harsh word. And then you mentioned in passing in your talk, one of the first acts to be passed is the Mixed Marriages Act, and then which is tied to the Group Areas Act. So separating people to ensure that something like that would not. And I would like you just to speak to this in the sense that apartheid is quite often and rightly so, seen for the disastrous machinery that it was and the disastrous effects that it had on our country, and then also in thinking more broadly across the world, how the term apartheid has now been used to describe what is happening in Gaza. So that on that end. But I would like you to speak to the inverse side of apartheid being incredibly inward and speaking to the deep fears of white people. That then bred out rooi gevaar, the fear of black people, not zwart gevaar, and then rooi gevaar, the fear of communism. I would like you to speak to that deeply embodied fear, because I think that's a thread that is carried throughout the book, is that fear.
Yeah, it's such a beautiful question. I really think fear, and we see it now with the whole AfriForum thing, and we see it, that fear is really the kind of affect at the heart of this identity. We are driven by fear. Fear is woven into our subjectivities in a kind of ways that, like, I think might be genetic also. And it makes sense, because historically we come to a place and we displace people and we claim a place at great violence, and we try to institute this extremely superficial, violent regime on a world that is not easily ordered in that way. And so it makes sense that fear is the kind of almost the texture of this identity, and then that fear is activated very specifically. For women also, it becomes, because of what's really important in the apartheid imagination, as you say, apartheid is about policing the erotic, because you want to keep white people separate. You want to make sure that purely white babies, and of course these are all fictions because race don't work like that. But you want to make sure that purely white babies are born, so you really have to make sure that the white women stay away from black men stay in place. And you want to make sure the white man needs to be in control of everything. So then fear becomes the narrative through which so much control is exerted over the white woman. She is made to be so scared of everything that's going on outside of so that's how you keep her at home. And that's how also it's literally at times when the white population during apartheid, when the authorities struggled to maintain unity in their kind of voting populations or so, they would literally, what would be activated was the narrative of the Black Peril. And the Black Peril was always an imagined epidemic of rapes by black men. People would say, oh, black men are out raping white women again, which if you actually look at the records, it wasn't happening. I mean, who were doing the raping? Mostly white men to black women. So it literally, and then, so it like at times the mining strikes between the white mine workers, then the white peril narrative would go again, and that would bring the white people together again, help them to band together again against, because of fear of the black men are out there raping the women, and then it's we must stand together. So it's literally a sexualized fear that was overtly activated in keeping to make sure everyone stays in place. Because obviously this is not a natural thing at all to try to keep people separate like this. And this shows also so much violence had to go into it. And then fear becomes a very powerful tool, and it is still activated. It's still, and it is something that I look at in the book all the time, is how I was raised to be so scared. And the only place I'm safe is when I have a white man with me. So it's that, and so then that keeps me in place, that directs my desire. And
it's also how fear is internalized, because the same character that I spoke about now, he says that in order for black peril to exist, white peril has to exist first. And they're speaking about the strata of class, which is something I would hope that it would come out in the Q&A now, is because he was speaking about the poor white problem and the need to teach these poor whites how to be white. Because the thing about poverty is that you're not going to care who your neighbor is if you're living in squalor. There was an actual, coming out of the Great Depression, there was an actual crisis economically, and that was their concern in the 30s, which then gave rise to the National Party. It is upon the rock of class and ethnicity that the National Party comes up. And it's funny enough that you speak about when black peril narrative exists, it is also at that moments of peril or at shared concern that the volksmoeder arises as this unifying figure, because scholars have argued that Afrikaner masculine identity was not ordered in the same way as feminine identity was. It wasn't homogenized in the same way. There's a homogenization that happens for volksmoeder. So with that, I'm going to open up for Q&A. Tim and then Sophia.
Thank you so much for that beautiful presentation, honestly. And maybe I'll start with a note and then kind of engage with a question. A note is, there's something, one that reads when someone is presenting in the room, like this call and response, right? And it's not just a thing. It's not that people are just happy about what you are saying, because I think sometimes it's easy. You're saying something that people agree with. But I think I was having this conversation with Prof. Pumla earlier. It's about an embodied research, and I wanted to point that out, that this is really important research in the sense of how, it takes a lot to embody the work that you're doing, and really one can note that, there's a psychosomatic connection, with your work, because you are really connected to it at that level, and it's inspiring, honestly. So thank you.
That's such a nice compliment. Thank you so much. I'm going to write it down. And
You're welcome. You're welcome. And I think this leads me to my question / comment as well. For me, one of the things that I'm reading, is an implicit and explicit prism in which you're functioning at in this critical kind of engagement with the thematic of this book, which is queerness, you know. And it's beautiful that you mentioned and engaged with the work of Hugo Kakana, because at the beginning of the book, he speaks about queerness and he tries a definition at queerness, right? And he says, queerness is a bottomless pit. It is the fluid infolds of possibility and imagination, right? And ultimately he says, but I grasp this word reproachingly, because every time I seek to grasp it, it escapes my grasp, you know. And there's a way in which you use it so implicitly in this kind of treading of imagination and possibility in your book. And I don't know if this question is all over the place, but like, how did you do that? How did you do that? Because for me, it was like, as an emerging scholar, you know, that's the thing that you're always asking yourself. How do you get to use theory or curate theory in a way that is not just abstract, but you can see it's, you know, that thing.
Your words mean so much to me. Thank you. I'm just basking in it. It's difficult. It's because especially when you start out, but it remains difficult because you are also in a position where you still need to jump through the hoops. Are you a PhD candidate?
Masters.
Okay, so you still need to jump through all the hoops, and you need to get examiners to kind of agree that what you're doing is real scholarship. And so then I only managed to start doing this kind of work, actually long after my PhD. I got the confidence. And even now with this book, it was a risky move to include so much of my own life. And I was stressing about it still like a few months, like a few weeks before I had to submit the final draft. I was thinking maybe I should take out all the personal parts. And so because you still think like, maybe I'm not going to be taken seriously by the academic establishment. And so it is very difficult, especially where you are. But I would say it's worth doing it, because that's when research, I think, things that we are busy with, especially in a space like this, it really is about our lives and our bodies. And so I would say stick with it, but also don't be too hard on yourself if you kind of compromise on that kind of thing while you still need to pass stuff. So, but you'll get to it. Yeah.
Okay, so clear. Thank you so much. This is such an exciting conversation, and I think I also really appreciate you taking that risk, you know, because I think that it only sort of pushes scholarship forward, and that not everyone's willing to do that because there's a potential cost. But anyway, that's just an aside. So I have one question and then a sort of comment or further thoughts. The one is, I'm so curious about your observations within our lifetime, because I know, you know, we sort of went to undergrad at a similar time, and so I'm placing myself along the similar trajectory in the 90s and 2000s, and particularly this idea of kind of socializing desire. And I'm thinking about, you know, young white women, white girls in South Africa, and this dual thing of sort of invisibilizing Black presences on the one hand, that trope of like, this so-and-so is part of the family, but they're never in any family photos. So that kind of invisible sister, or which you still hear people talking about today. And then this othering and this fear and this, you know, and just thinking about also as someone who's raising a child and sort of it in today, seeing that race doesn't come naturally for children. I mean, they're not born with the concept. So that idea of where, you know, that what are the stories of today? Like if in the 90s it was the sort of, you know, girl sexual purity, how do you see that being reproduced? Because I'm thinking, how do you break that cycle? You know, that you don't get to a point where as an aware kind of adult woman, you're questioning your desire, but as a child, as an adolescent, you're allowed to have more, you know, where do those barriers start to come in, where you're kind of socialized to say, oh no, not that person, or that person is an invisible person in my life, or so that's sort of one. Like, do you see them changing? Are the moms using the same old Is it the same as when we were kids? Or do you see anything positive? Do you see that kind of breaking? And then another, this is not, obviously incorporated within your research, which is already dealing with so much, but I'm just so curious tangentially about what we can learn from racially mixed families about racialization, that in so many ways, it's not just white communities that keep themselves apart. The narratives about who we are and why we shouldn't be with X, Y, Z. I think that manifests in many different types of communities within South Africa, and that's our inheritance also, sadly. And kind of, people who become more Black, become more white in the sense of how they are then re-socialized because it happens too, much more than I think we give credit for. And I think understanding those processes also help those little openings of seeing like it does happen. It's happening. Yeah. So your thoughts?
Those were 3 big questions. Let me answer that first because there are 3. Or I'm going to answer 1.5 of your questions. Is that fine? So the thing about our time is I think about our time a lot because we, so Sophia and I are 39 now, so we were 8 years old. So. Is it a secret here, your age? I'm the young ones. I do that too. So we were 8 years old with the Democratic in 1994. And I really grew up with that triumphant narrative that apartheid is over now. We are a new kind of people. This is a new world. And I think that's what shocked me so much. Just when I started also, well, it's my research that brought me deeply into these topics. But of course, also when it comes to the research, because you are asking questions. But this total disconnect between the narrative that we grew up with and the actual lives that we have been living and the ways and that is of course also a failure of the transition process, right? Where I really think that white people were not forced to properly reckon or not, maybe we shouldn't have been forced, but we should have been, I don't know, there should have been more, I don't know what, but incentives or education, but that more should have happened, that we must look in the mirror critically because our parents just continued with their lives as it was, and because structurally things didn't change much, things just basically stayed the same. And I look at my life now, and I'm not sure that it's so much different than my mother's life would have been at my age, in terms of if I walk into the restaurant, who's sitting, it's a lot of white people sitting in the I live in Middle Cape Town, and it's still shockingly white in the restaurants. And so it's this crazy dissonance between the narratives, and also we also grew up with a narrative, or I did, that we don't need feminism because we are liberated, strong women because our mothers were working. And that also for me fell flat when I started realizing how much we feel very liberated, but we all end up still doing the same things that our grandmothers were doing and their grandmothers were doing. So I think there is such a dissonance in our generation also. The question about children, it's such a difficult question, and that's one of the reasons I'm like relieved every day I don't have children. How do you do it better? And how do you, because I know in schools also, another friend of mine told me her children are in Jan van Riebeeck school in Cape Town. So it's a very good school in the middle of the city, literally in Kloof Street, right in the middle of the city. Well, apart from the fact that its name is Jan van Riebeeck, one would think that they're a bit more self-aware. But they celebrated the other day, Milk Tart Day, and the children were told to dress according to the dress code. And my friend is like, at first she thought they must be dressed in like cream and cinnamon or something. Then now she got the brief. It was they must dress like Dutch settlers. Literally, this is today. I mean, this is this year. So then it's like, how are we, I mean, what are we even, so yeah, I mean, raising children, it must be, because now you try at home to do something different and then they have like settler day at schools. I'm sure you're doing a good job.
But it just goes to show how broad socialization is. It's not just what you do in the home, it's also what happens to that child exists elsewhere.
Hi, I'm Tiffany. Thank you very much. I think, so I'll comment and then I'll talk. So firstly, thank you very much. I think it was almost made me gasp a lot of times, in the sense that it makes me lose my breath, because I just don't think there are white women who are looking at themselves, and it's crazy to find that there are. And I almost feel in some sense that I'm perhaps living under a rock, which is a really nice feeling to have. Just because it encourages my brain to want to look and seek a little bit further than when you're a person of color, you're taken up a lot with what's going on immediately around you. And I think so I work at Stellenbosch, and I think when you work here, you can't avoid just paying attention to that all the time. And so it's incredible to have you share yourself like that. Secondly, so I'm doing my master's research, and I actually think that as you go further, a comment is to look at arts-based research, just because my work is arts-based, and I'm looking at the colored identity, and I'm working with my female lineage. And so you incredibly said you struggle with that you struggle with that conversation, and your work was actually very triggering for me just to listen to you, in the sense that I can't deny the whiteness in my lineage and trajectory. So it's actually very sore to listen to you feel it. But in many ways, it makes me quite considerate about the white women I find myself around, which are only colleagues and one friend, but that's because she thinks like you do. So I find it, and just like positionality. But what I want to know is, when you have done this presentation, or when you have spoken about your work, what are all of the rooms filled with academic, open-minded, helpful, white women who are trying to learn and trying to figure it out? Or have you been in spaces where you are having these conversations? If you were to present in an inhierke, what are you going with? Security? What's your plan? What's your plan? And then obviously I'm also then asking, what have the responses been from white women? Because you are talking, it's like uncovering secrets here, to the whole world, to all of the colors, to all of the belief systems, you're showing us what it is. And I think maybe that's why I feel triggered, because you showed me, and you just spoke a little bit, so I can't wait to buy it. So thank you very much for that. But more than that, what is...
Thank you for all of your thoughts and the generous response. Won't you send me an email? I would love to hear more about your work. And I think arts-based research is such a good way because this kind of work is so embodied, and so it's about flesh and bones and cells, and it's like it's not just data. So that sounds great. So the interesting thing I was extremely stressed about this book before it came out. I was thinking, because normally I write, I'm an Afrikaans writer. I write in Afrikaans, I write fiction. So I have a following of very kind of not academic white Afrikaans people. And I was absolutely terrified how people are going to respond, and I'm going to lose my entire following of readers, and people are going to send AfriForum Youth is going to pitch Afrikaans. Real things. I was scared. But actually, weirdly, But I think that's the Afrikaner talent, is like putting your head in the sand. Like, you don't see the things that really upset you. You don't engage. You don't need to see it. Like, you just don't go that. So that's really been so the audiences that have come, the white Afrikaans women so many people have told me their stories of like young women, like 19 years old, and they would tell me they're in love with a black boy, and like they're so in love, but she's so scared to go to her parents, and like it's like, I heard so many such beautiful stories, and then you're like, oh, it's worth it. Or like lots of queer stories, women engaging about their, and queer people talking about all of that. So, but no, I haven't had like any harsh. Weirdly, I'm scared still that someone is going to see this book and it's something. But I think white people who don't want to hear it are just really ignoring it. So, which is great and not great.
I think that's incredibly powerful. That I would think they burn your house down, but I'm really glad that they haven't. And I really hope that we all buy it before they burn the books or take them off the shelf, so that we can pass it on. And in many ways, it's also blessed me because you said things that have triggered so many incredible thoughts in my brain, but this incredible idea of writing. I believe that because of the history of colored stuff, it's been written out of history and not in the sense of like erased, in the sense of like just someone put their head in the sand and ignored that side even exists. And so I think it's so powerful that you can write about it and in many ways highlight that it exists and highlight that it's actually at the base of this identity, and the way these two identities operate are so complex. And so thank you for sharing yourself, because it made me want to cry, and it encouraged me. And I'm just, thank you, really appreciative.
Thanks so much for that.
Thank you.
Azille, there are still so many questions that I have. There's still so many. I think that is the value of the book itself, is that there are so many questions. And then to the book itself, I think audience here is very important. Throughout the book, you say the Afrikaner herself. And that was, to me, I found that very striking, the Afrikaner herself, because you are also engaging with a particular audience, but you're subverting that audience at the same time. So in closing, I'm going to read a note to the introduction right at the end of the book. This book is written mostly in English rather than so that it can reach a broader academic audience. Gemma, that was your concern. However, the texture of this book is deliberately Afrikaans, as a way to aesthetically and textually reflect something of the culture and the language from within which I am writing.
Thank you for listening to the Averick podcast. For more insights, research, and reflections, visit our website or follow us online and join the reparative journey.